Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress today on March 26th. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Joshua Robinson and Jonathan Clegg of the Wall Street Journal, two absolutely fantastic sports journalists and authors to discuss their new book, The Formula: How Rogues, Geniuses, and Speed Freaks Re-Engineered F1 into the World's Fastest Growing Sport. This book joins a body of work that is absolutely fantastic in addition to their regular reporting with the Wall Street Journal. They also wrote a book about Premier League football called The Club, and one of probably the greatest proper football rivalry in history of Ronaldo versus Messi, another fantastic book. I highly recommend it. We're joined today to talk about how Formula One and Premier League have been shaped by geopolitics and the economics of global business. As you will know, Formula One and Premier League football are truly international global brands and rapidly growing. So it's a great time to be talking about this, talking about what's happening in terms of the world of finance and business, and of course, shamelessly for me, talking about my favorite sport, which is Formula One. So thank you, Joshua, and thank you, Jonathan, for joining us today. I'll turn it over to you to kind of talk about what inspired the book, what drove you to write the book, and just some general reflections on it, and then we'll jump straight into a discussion about it.
Thanks so much for having us. We really appreciate it. I guess the genesis of the book was I was in Miami 2 years ago covering the Grand Prix, and we had just written, as you mentioned, the book about the Premier League and its global reach and its global influence and how it became this really planetary sports and entertainment monster. And we were at the time just finishing up Messi versus Ronaldo, which was kind of the same approach, and also looked at how these two guys used football, used rivalry, the rivalry of Barcelona and Real Madrid and everything else to become two of the most famous people who have ever walked the earth. They accessed a level of fame that is really reserved only for US presidents and popes. And so I was at the Miami Grand Prix and I was in the airport afterwards, and we were texting, having just watched this like incredibly over-the-top show that was suddenly wildly popular in America, and saw the draw of A-listers and everyone else trying desperately to get close to Formula One. And we had an exchange and said, I think this is the next book. And we turned around and 22 months later, here we are. This is very much in the same spirit as The Club and Messi Ronaldo, exploring this cast of characters that's really full of maniacs in many ways. And the crazy money that is poured into it, and how all of these things combine to create a product that is unbelievably popular all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, just to to reiterate what Josh said, it just really felt, a couple of years ago when we started this book that Formula One was sort of in the midst of this moment that has sort of really elevated its standing, both in America but also globally. The time was right to do it. The funny thing about F1 is that there have been plenty of books written about F1, but almost all of them are about an individual team or an individual season or an individual driver. And very few of them have actually covered the sort of, soup to nuts tale of how F1 started in the 1950s and became, what is really today probably the only truly global sports league.
Oh, it's utterly a fantastic story. And what's particularly interesting for me, so I was introduced first to Formula One in college by one of my best friends. He grew up in Malaysia, was going to Malaysia Grand Prix, and he's like, "Hey, have you ever watched this?" And I was like, "No." And I started watching it, was hooked. And this is back in the days when the only thing you could really do is maybe ESPN would cover one race. I had to go to Borders bookstore, and of course, I'm dating myself here, and buy the $30 F1 official magazine that was 6 months out of date and whatnot. But now you have this huge influx of fans, particularly in the United States, which really seems to be driven in the Liberty Media era. And I wonder if we can start there and how much Liberty Media's acquisition of F1 has really transformed the brand and the sport into something that was certainly very big in Europe and the Middle East to some degree, but now, as you said, it's this truly global brand.
Well, I think it's important to kind of rewind and look back at what the product Liberty Media actually acquired was. For most of its history, F1 was controlled by a single man named Bernie Eccleston, who's a former used car dealer. He's about 5'3" with a mop of white hair. And he built F1. He was a driver agent and then a team owner, and he built F1 from the 70s into this global TV product, but did it in such a way that all of the details, all of the contracts, all of the agreements and stakeholders were contained entirely within Bernie Ecclestone's own mind. So he was the only one who knew the true functioning and the true web and network of F1. And so it meant that the business plateaued at some point. He made a lot of money. He was at one point the highest paid CEO in Britain. And, you know, some of the teams made money, but overall, there were still other aspects of the business that needed to be first cleaned up and then could be expanded. For instance, the United States was a market that he quickly gave up on. He was very frustrated with bringing racing to America and never quite got there and decided, you know what, the expansion is going to be eastward instead. We're going to go to the Middle East. We're going to go to Asia. He even wanted to go to Russia, which he succeeded in doing. So he sold part of the business to a private equity fund in London called CVC. They did a lot of the things that you need to do to bring a business into the 21st century. So cleaned up a lot of it, formalized a lot of the agreements and focused on expansion. And then the problem was that F1 was kind of past its peak at that point. The real peak was in the late 80s and 90s. And after that, it became kind of boring. Ratings were dipping. But CVC just about cleaned it up enough to sell it on to someone else who maybe thought they could take it to the next level. That turned out to be Liberty Media, which is an American media company started by John Malone and run in those days by Chase Carey. They own the Atlanta Braves. They're tied into Live Nation, that kind of live entertainment business. And what they saw in F1 was a global series with a lot of cachet, you know, some really premium brands in there. Ferrari ties into Rolex and Tag Heuer and things like that. But that was not leveraged enough with a huge missed opportunity in North America. That's what they bought for about $8 billion and decided, okay, what do we do now? And what they landed on in part was the Netflix series, which helped, but there were a lot of other factors. And a big part of it was trying to bring it into the United States in a meaningful way.
Could you also talk a little bit about the extent to which, you know, Liberty Media's acquisition really helped pull the sport also very much into the digital age? I mean, there's a great little anecdote you have in your book about how, you know, Sir Lewis Hamilton was getting cease and desist letters from posting his own photos on Instagram, and now he's one of the most, you know, widely recognized sporting figures in the world.
Yeah, I think, you know, that again, a lot of this goes back to Bernie Ecclestone, his approach to running F1, which was to you know, keep everything very closely guarded. The idea that the pit lane and the paddock were these sort of very sacred places that should remain incredibly exclusive and private was in some ways a masterstroke, because it really enabled Bernie to, through his creation of what's known as the Paddock Club, he was able to sort of revamp corporate hospitality in F1 and charge people, you know, fortune to go behind the velvet rope and, you know, sort of see what was actually happening in those areas that were generally walled off from TV coverage. But in order to grow the sport, I think Liberty correctly recognized that people want to see what's happening behind the scenes. And you know, it was certainly, you know, part of F1's growth has been about the fact that it is sort of opened up in that way. You know, F1 barely had any sort of social media presence when Liberty Media took over, and this was, you know, years after every other league had sort of, you know, focused on that side of things. So, you know, they correctly recognized that that was, you know, something that was lacking, and between that and the TV show and various other things that they've done, they really managed to sort of, you know, give F1 in a sense the sort of, you know, American sports treatment, and that was, you know, in the same way that a lot of the Premier League's early successes were inspired by what the owners of English soccer clubs saw happening in the US sports leagues at that time. F1 also took a page out of the US sports book, you know, particularly what's happening, you know, particularly how the sort of NBA approaches its digital media rights, and what was once a very, you know, sort of secretive and exclusive sport is now, you know, there's now footage from, you know, the garages like all over social media.
And what I would add to that is that it was also a hard to understand sport. you know, it was very clubby. It was really designed for petrol heads who tuned in to hear about downforce and tire compounds and things like that. And what Liberty did was realize we have to make this much more accessible. We have to, you know, put basic things like you know, the live race order on screen. We have to know where everyone is, so you know what you're looking at. Having more explainers, having more cameras, making it more dramatic and cinematic too. Getting the drivers to have personalities and kind of displaying those to the audience. You know, the guy who came in to redo their TV operations, a guy named David Hill, who had previously worked with Rupert Murdoch on the Premier League and later on the NFL. So the ties are very clear there. You know, those are not connections that we're inventing. But he came in and said, one of the first things you have to do is get these drivers to take their helmets off the moment they're out of the car. Anytime they're not in the car, we have to see their faces because they are this cast of young, rich, good-looking guys who can build a relationship to an audience in that way. So people are going to tune in for that too. And I think we saw that with Drive to Survive. People were not tuning in for the racing in that. You know, they were tuning in for these young, rich, good-looking guys backbiting and sniping at each other.
Well, you have an anecdote in there, especially about Drive to Survive, that I thought was quite interesting, how Mercedes and Ferrari were very resistant in the early days to Drive to Survive, because it's like, why do we need to get involved in this? It's just, you know, all theater. And then how they came around to seeing it. Now, you know, Toto Wolff is just about on every episode, the team principal for Mercedes. But then the flip side of it is you have Max Verstappen, the dominant driver from Red Bull, who is almost tailor-made, it would seem, for the social media digital age, Drive to Survive, and he wants to have almost nothing to do with it. Could you talk about that dynamic and kind of how the Netflix aspect joined in with F1 sort of purists and that the changing dynamic of what Liberty Media was trying to do for the demographics, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think when the idea was first presented to F1, many of them had the same idea that Max Verstappen has now, which was that they wanted no part of this thing. And I think that was largely a hang up from, you know, like we say, the fact that the idea of having, you know, TV cameras, you know, following them around in the pit lane would have been completely unthinkable just a few years earlier. And, you know, just the sense that they didn't really, you know, they weren't sure that this thing was going to work, right? There have been many fly on the wall documentaries that have been made about all sorts of sports, and none of them has really sort of landed as hard or as you know, sort of lifted the sport in the same way that Drive to Survive has done for F1. So I think there was a lot of suspicion and sort of skepticism about that in the early days. You know, partly as well because Drive to Survive was not the only idea that Liberty Media had for how to you know, get people more interested in F1. They also had the idea of installing a sort of mini train like you get at the Hollywood studios that would sort of take you around the pit lane and the paddock, and you know that idea, you know, never got off the starting line, but Drive to Survive did, and you know, I think it was a real opportunity for the guys who recognized the opportunity were the sort of teams that had been stuck in the middle of the pack, who were sort of largely forgotten by you know, TV audiences back then. You know, for a long time, F1 TV broadcasts had basically followed around the car at the front, and they were shown on TV for as much as sort of 40% of the broadcast. And what that meant is that the teams in the middle rarely even appeared on the TV screen. It was actually more valuable to be one of the teams right at the back, because at least your cars were getting lapped by the guy in the front. And so you'd be on TV for the brief seconds while they overtook. So, so I think that the teams in the middle really sort of recognized that this was a chance for, you know, to sort of display themselves in a way that they had been sort of overlooked previously. And that's why it was the likes of, you know, Red Bull, who at that stage were not, you know, one of the front running teams, and the rest, who really sort of, you know, capitalized on Drive to Survive in the early days. And it was only later that Toto Wolff became aware. I think it was on the flight back from Australia. He watched the first season of Drive to Survive. And, you know, he told us that he thought it was a complete nightmare watching what he saw. But by the time he landed and went to stay with his relatives, all of a sudden his like little nieces and nephews who had no interest in his F1 career before were sort of stunned that Uncle Toto was the star of this sport that they had no interest in previously. So so that helped persuade Mercedes and Ferrari to become involved, and that really marked a stage where Drive to Survive took off. Partly obviously because now all the teams were involved, but also partly because that second season of Drive to Survive dropped very conveniently in February of 2020, right before we were all about to spend a year on the couch. So those two things really helped sort of galvanize Drive to Survive. And even to this day, people in F1 aren't sure whether the sort of the sort of confluence of the timing and the fact that people had nothing to watch and sports were cancelled, whether it's that sort of propelled F1, or whether this was the sort of masterstroke that Liberty Media could see coming all along.
So we have Tiger King and Drive to Survive during COVID. It's a rather odd ends of the different spectrum there. I want to bring it back forward to where we are today. So we now have a race calendar that's 24 races. It is just about every continent of the world except Africa as of right now, although there was previously races down in South Africa, if I'm not mistaken. And there's concerns that it seemed to be relatively new, and certainly for longtime fans, rather amusing, of sort of the dominance of Max Verstappen and Red Bull, obviously until this past weekend with their brake issue, that is making the sport, in inverted commas, is more boring now. Where do you see Liberty Media and F1 going now that it's done what it's set out to do? It's established a sort of global brand. It's all present. And in your book, you talk about how they're working to create a series of fans who are, I don't know quite the way that you have phrased, but basically fans who are unlikely to go to, say, a race, but are fans nonetheless, very much like the Premier League. And I do want to come back to the Premier League in a second. Where does F1 go, 2025, 2026 on the broader global scale, recognizing kind of where we are today?
Well, I think the central question that every sports entity is facing right now, and whether it's F1 or the Premier League, and I think we've had the same conversations in both worlds, but the question is, who are you servicing? Who are you there for? Is it the 50,000 fans who might come to, who might have season tickets and come to every game, or the 400,000 who might come to one Grand Prix over the course of a weekend? Or is it the potential audience of billions who might never come to your event and only follow it through television or associated products like Drive to Survive or drivers' Instagrams or things like that? And so that figuring out that balance has become the major challenge of sports in the 21st century. And everyone is trying a slightly different approach. F1 really skewed towards the non-event fan base and decided to accept that there will be people who will never come to a race, who might never even watch a race, but still call themselves quite devoted and committed F1 fans because they engage with the drivers in different ways. They watch Drive to Survive. I've actually had people tell me that they avoid the races and don't watch on a Sunday because they don't want to spoil the season of Drive to Survive that'll come out a year from now. It's a really wild new way to consume sports. But F1 has said this is not an invalid way. So we're going to welcome all these people into the tent because you know what? They consume the product, they go and buy the $150 t-shirts, and they're talking about it, they're posting about it. So all of that is part of the new sports ecosystem. And so, as it looks ahead to 2025 and 6 and figuring out maybe a post Drive to Survive future, F1 is really kind of at the cutting edge of figuring out what that world is going to look like. I'm not sure anyone has the answer yet, but they're throwing a lot of stuff at the wall. We know that F1, for instance, is working on this Apple Jerry Bruckheimer Brad Pitt movie as a way to bring people into the world of F1 without having any element of competition or live sport. It's just a big summer blockbuster. We know they're creating arcades where you can have kind of driving sim experiences. They worked on specifically kids products like a cartoon. So they're really trying a lot of different approaches and hoping that they hit another bullseye the way they did with Drive to Survive.
Yeah, I think as well as the other sort of dynamic that F1 is sort of aware of and has to sort of navigate a little delicately is not just, as Josh said, the sort of difference between the spectators who attend the races and those who just watch it on TV or consume it through, other media platforms. But, F1 also has this sort of slightly awkward relationship between the sort of traditional fans who, grew up loving a sport that was sort of largely about a bunch of guys in garages tweaking, things with a wrench and creating, magnificent driving machines, and the sort of new fans who have been drawn in by Drive to Survive and the sort of idea of the sport as more of a kind of soap opera. And, I think balancing, the competing demands of those two constituencies is going to be a difficult challenge for F1. On the one hand, you want that there's a sort of, growing appetite for even more sort of data and, real-time analysis of what's happening on the track with, tire degradation and suspension levels and and then there are people who have literally could not be less interested in that side of things, but do want more of Christian Horner and Toto Wolff yelling at each other. So I think that's another slightly awkward thing that they have to sort of navigate. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the sort of traditional fans who have underpinned the sport's success for many decades find things like the $150 baseball caps and $350 lobster rolls completely horrendous, and are sort of almost turned off by the kind of brand of by the sort of sheen of US corporatism that Liberty Media has sort of placed on what was sort of initially a very sort of amateurish European sport.
And one place I think where we see that dynamic play out is just, as you mentioned, the schedule. You look at the 24 team, the 24 race of calendar, and more, it's that tension between the old world traditional races, and we know there were some very tense negotiations with Monaco, and Liberty has considered a non-Monaco future. And then we see them adding races in places like Las Vegas, which are the pinnacle of, as John said, American corporatism, the glitz, the show, the modern Netflix era of F1, where it's all about the spectacle. And even as Max Verstappen said, 99% about the show and 1% about the racing.
It was very interesting with the Hunger Games presentation in the Vegas side, and then the bizarre sort of LL Cool J rapping in Miami, and just sort of the almost, it seems like they want to create, certainly in the United States, outside of perhaps the Texas race, almost a Super Bowl like atmosphere in Miami, and certainly Vegas, to kind of capture that energy and enthusiasm for the era. I have to be candidly a bit more of a purist on it. I mean, Monaco was one of the first races that I watched, so getting rid of Monaco is kind of abhorrent to me. But you mentioned the F1 arcades. It's actually rather interesting. There was an announcement that there's supposed to be one coming to Washington, D.C., out in Union Market. I haven't heard much on that, although I'm very, very excited, having been to the one in London. I spent far too much time and far too much money. They opened very early. But it's very interesting to see kind of how they're looking to do that. I think it's London, Birmingham, Boston, and possibly Washington, D.C. next. So it's very, very exciting. I want to turn a little bit to the Premier League, if I can, because you mentioned how they Formula One is trying to capture kind of that fan base and similar model where you have fans globally. I mean, I think many of us remember the image of, I think it was a young boy who had a homemade Messi jersey in Afghanistan, for example. How has sort of Premier League grown from what was a whole bunch of clubs in the United Kingdom to these billion-dollar brands with massive stadiums, as well as sort of the La Liga in Italy and what was going on in Spain? Like, how's EPL taken over the world?
It's a big question, but I think one of the key factors that always comes back is the Premier League understood before anyone else that it was fundamentally not a soccer league. It was a TV product that happened to organize games between 11 guys from different cities in the UK every Saturday. That was the quantum leap that it made before any other league in Europe, starting with 1992, when the top 20 clubs, or 24 in those days, broke away from the rest of the structure of English soccer, which had been sharing TV money equally through the entire ladder of 92 professional clubs. And so the top 24, which is now reduced to 20, decided, you know what, we actually don't need to share with these people. We can form our own league, the Premier League, negotiate our own TV rights. And that was backed by Rupert Murdoch, who signed the initial deal with Sky. and they grew from there. But by condensing those earnings and keeping them within the clubs that were in that top tier, that then gave them more spending power. That then allowed them to bring in more foreign talent. And by the late 90s, it was impossible to catch the Premier League.
I guess one of the questions that kind of comes out of that is, especially as we're talking about sort of the geopolitics and kind of bringing that in there, but how have you seen the influx of, significant money from the Gulf, the oligarchs of Russia, Roman Abramovich with Chelsea now no longer there? How has that sort of shaped, as you said, was very much kind of local city clubs, and where is that going to go in the future? It seems like there's this arms race, excuse me, for billion-dollar plus stadiums. Kylian Mbappe is one of the most expensive players in the world. What is the dynamic there, and how is that foreign money shaping the EPL?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just shaping the EPL; it's shaping, global soccer more broadly. Yeah, I mean, the although it's the Gulf that's the sort of driver of that investment right now, we can't forget that initially it was Roman Abramovich who bought into Chelsea, and his money totally transformed English soccer and skewed the market. For as long as the Premier League is the sort of dominant global property that it is, these clubs will always be very desirable for huge overseas investors, and that's not likely to stop. I think that the big thing is that it's really sort of, at the moment, it's created a sort of divide among Europeans in European soccer, where there are really only now sort of a half dozen teams who can compete for the very best tier of players. Kylian Mbappe looks likely to leave Paris Saint-Germain this summer, but the number of clubs that could reasonably expect to sign him, you could count on the fingers of one hand, because they basically have to be backed by a petrostate, or one of the sort of very small number of traditional superpowers of European soccer, of which there are 3 or 4. Looks like Real Madrid will be the one that he signs with. But even Real Madrid has spent the past sort of decade wrestling with how it can compete. Real Madrid, the most decorated soccer team that has ever been assembled, has spent the last decade wrestling with how it can possibly compete with what it refers to as the state clubs, whose pockets seem completely endless, and who can spend whatever they want on players, even as European soccer has some sort of financial constraints on the spending power of clubs. There are ways around those. We know that Real Madrid, for instance, considered relocating from its stadium, the Bernabeu, one of the sort of iconic stadiums of European soccer, to a new stadium on the outskirts of Madrid that would be built inside a theme park. That they thought that perhaps to compete with the likes of Qatar-sponsored PSG, or Abu Dhabi-sponsored Manchester City, the way to do it was to essentially build a Disney World on the outskirts of Madrid, which the stadium would be a sort of central part. You'd get off one amusement ride, and then go watch Mbappe and Jude Bellingham training, before their big game on the Saturday or whatever. I mean, these from a distance, obviously, this seems a completely ludicrous idea, but I think it goes to show how much the sort of imbalance that these state-owned clubs have created in European soccer, the imbalance that now exists, and just how even the most, like I say, the most illustrious teams are really unsure of how they can possibly compete in a market that has been totally upended by the arrival of these outside investors.
Correct me if I'm wrong, it was not too long ago, I think it's 2021, 2022, there were discussions about having a breakaway super league within Premier League football, but also on the continent as well. It got all the way up to Prime Minister Boris Johnson, obviously looking for a low-hanging fruit in which to jump on and hopefully address some of his reputational issues, shall we say. Got involved on it. What was the genesis of that, and what is sort of the lasting effects of the attempt for that breakaway?
The idea of a super league, a closed super league with only the best clubs competing against each other and kind of really jacking up the TV revenue, because it's the idea of like a heavyweight prize fight every night, has been around for decades in soccer. But because what soccer has that, say, the major American leagues don't, is relegation. The fact that you have to re-qualify for the top competitions every year, that if you finish sixth in the Premier League, you're not going to be in the Champions League the following year, blows a potentially $40 million hole in your budget, or $80 million in some cases. And so you can't plan for the long term, but also suddenly you're out of that club for a season. All of that has been weighing on owners' minds for a long time. But the pandemic really brought a lot of those chickens home to roost, because suddenly there was a lot of lost income. The clubs were in more dire financial straits. Real Madrid, as John mentioned, was one of them. And so that was the catalyst for them to go ahead and pull the trigger on this idea, which brought together the giants of Spain, Italy, and England, as the case was, proposing a kind of closed league, an alternative to the Champions League, where they would divide up the money in a very different way. They would have permanent spots for the aristocracy of European soccer. So Real Madrid would be there every year, Liverpool would be there every year, Manchester United. But it blew up so spectacularly, because the communications were mismanaged. And once fans got wind of this, they thought this actually is an assault on the fundamental premise of European soccer, which is anyone theoretically could win any competition through merit alone. This would have just entrenched the kind of world order that super money had created in soccer over the past 10 years. But the idea hasn't entirely gone away. We know that the Champions League is changing its format from next year for more guaranteed game, to create more guaranteed games for teams, more TV exposure, which means more TV money. And that was a kind of reaction. And there are still ideas being pitched for an alternative to the Champions League. But that Super League was a moment of, we're going to do what the Premier League did in 1992, break away, get more of that TV pie for ourselves and divide it in a way that we find acceptable. The Super League was the same philosophy.
Can you talk about the parallels, if there are any, if it's appropriate to say that there are parallels with where we're at right now with a potential expansion of F1? 2026 is the new big rule change. Andretti here in the United States made a big push to enter, going from 10 to 11 teams. But curiously, the FIA, if I'm not mistaken, said that they thought it would bring more, the F1 would bring more benefit to Andretti than it would the other way around. How is that playing out right now? And are the teams going to expand, and who else might be entering the field?
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, that's sort of the inverse of the Super League situation, right? F1 is effectively a closed shop with just 10 teams. And I think since those teams feel like they were the ones who were responsible for the sport's, rapid growth over the last sort of half decade, they are resistant to the idea of letting anyone else come in and share the money that they feel that they've helped deliver. So yeah, so I think that's again a challenge of trying to persuade teams that sometimes what's in the interest of the sport and growing the sport more broadly is not always in the interests of their their bottom lines. And for the same reason that part of the sort of magic and global appeal of soccer, professional soccer through the years, is the idea that a team from the very bottom of the pyramid could one day rise to the very top. F1 teams might sort of have to recognize that expanding the field and maybe making things open, making the series more competitive might be in the interests of the sport, even though it's not necessarily in the interests of the top teams. The issue is that throughout the course of F1 history, one team in particular, Ferrari, has basically overruled any attempts at making the sport more competitive and doing anything that's not in the express interest of Ferrari. So again, that sort of comes to Ferrari's special place in F1 history. The fact that the two of them are, so tied up together that it's impossible to, envision one without the other. So, I think it will be in the same way that forming the European Super League, was the sort of idea that made sense on paper, but was hard to, actually deliver. I think that, expanding the F1 field much beyond 10, might also prove to be harder than they imagine. They've already said they're maxed out at 24 races. So, in some ways, increasing the number of teams in the field is the only real way to juice the revenues. But it's hard to know, how successful they'll be in trying to do that.
I want to come back to the state of Formula One right now, but I want to go back to a point that you were touching upon earlier, with the influx, particularly with the Premier League, of golf-backed money, but also when we looked at LIV Tour for golf, and accusations of inverted commas sports washing, that where countries like Saudi Arabia are using their financial largesse to buy access to sports leagues and sports venues and the like, to wash off the stain of human rights abuses or allegations thereof. How is that shaping things? And it seems to kind of ebb and flow depending on kind of the news cycle. What has your reporting kind of shown about the sports washing and the concerns thereof?
I mean, it's very clear that the entire exercise that the Gulf countries have participated in sports and expanding into sports was an exercise in reputation management. And they don't hide this. If you look back at many of the documents that Gulf countries produced sort of in the 2000s, as they laid out a post-oil future, a post sort of gas future as well, they identified sports as a potential place to, one, diversify revenues, but also put themselves on the map for something besides producing oil and gas. And we saw this movement really happen in the 2000s with places like Qatar beginning to bid to host the World Cup. Saudi was a little bit further behind, but Bahrain, for instance, hosted a Grand Prix in, I believe, 2005 or 2004. They were in there before soccer, before in F1. And so, carving off little pieces of the sports world to either bring those shows to the Gulf with tennis tournaments and prize fights and things like that, or F1 in this case, was a way to associate the name with something else, but then also going outside and buying clubs like Manchester City and putting the word Etihad on the stadium and the jerseys, which is the flagship carrier of Abu Dhabi and owned by the state, was yet another way to create new associations for these countries and just put them in the public consciousness, reach, through the Premier League, you're reaching 195 countries and a potential audience of billions every weekend. So it's just such a powerful vehicle for reaching a lot of people at once and tapping into affiliations that already exist. If you're a Man City fan, and have been for 30 years, are you going to ask a lot of questions about Etihad being on the stadium? Probably not.
We actually have a question that just came in that will kind of blend a bit of both of these. So Netflix's show, The English Game, explores how the FA realized that it had to let go of soccer, so they settled for controlling the laws and owning the league itself. It took the threat of a splinter league. Could the Gulf states start their own supercar league, presumably F1, with new teams?
Well, we know that they are. I mean, obviously, Saudi for one is a huge sponsor of F1 through Aramco. We know that there were reports of Saudi bid for F1 to buy the whole series last year, year before last. I think some of the figures thrown around at that time, I think it was the idea that they would buy the series for 20 billion, might have been slightly exaggerated, but we do know that Saudi has a lot of interest. I don't know that starting a rival series is necessarily the way to go. Partly because, like I say, so much of F1 is tied up with the brands and the teams that we have associated with F1 through the years, and a supercar series without Ferrari or Mercedes would seem to be missing the very sort of key ingredients that make part of the sort of allure of F1 is that it's the same, automotive brands that we know and have, have sort of dominated motorsport throughout history. The fact that they're competing, adds to the sense of the prestige and that this is the best, the best series on earth. So, I think it would be hard to sort of extricate. Ferrari has never competed in IndyCar or NASCAR, for instance. It's very much ties its identity to F1. And simply put, a racing series without Ferrari would just not have the same sort of glamour and prestige of F1. And I think that, we've seen that, fans of individual teams and individual sports have been happy to sort of live with the, possible sort of queasy feelings they might have from an association with a state, with states that have, maybe dubious human rights records or what have you. But when it comes to, sort of changing the very sort of structure of the sport, as we saw with the Super League, people's feeling, that tends to arouse emotions in a much stronger way. And it's harder to create a sort of new breakaway league than it is to just buy the one that already exists.
It's just entertaining the extent to which we talk about the penetration of Formula One into the United States. I mean, we go back to Talladega Nights and the Ballad of Ricky Bobby, and the underlying plot of the NASCAR driver versus the F1, and just that and how much things have fundamentally changed there. I want to bring it back to kind of where we're at today and the state of the sport and the issues that have come up certainly in this year. Liberty Media was on a ascendancy, driving social media, bringing in particularly women, bringing in diverse audiences to the sport. And this year, there's been a couple significant challenges. I think we could be fair to say. We've had allegations of impropriety by Christian Horner, the team principal of Red Bull, against a female staffer, and how that's been handled. We have allegations against the FIA president of interfering with decisions about Ferdinand Alonso for Aston Martin, and is also the certification for Las Vegas. Is this potentially a crisis point, or is just sort of a bump in the road? And is it very much a function of how things play out? And what do you see the impact of this? I mean, most fans are not going to remember, Spygate or Crashgate, which you cover in this book, and we could talk about a bit about that. But are these things potentially going to upset the progress that Liberty Media has made, and where do we go from here, I guess?
I think it's a factor of, kind of the growth of any league like this, that there will be bumps in the road and there will be scandal. It's kind of inevitable. The fact that it came for Christian Horner, which is, who became a main character of Drive to Survive, is a problem for Netflix, but it's a problem of Christian Horner's own making. And the situation is that, whether he sticks around or not, I think they have enough momentum to kind of move past it. Netflix and a series like Drive to Survive is very good at creating characters, finding a new heel to focus on. And I think they'll do that. But, this is the first time that F1, since its real explosion, has had to consider what that turnover of characters looks like. Some fan favorites have come back, like Daniel Ricciardo, who's a real star of season one, and surfed on that Drive to Survive wave to immense popularity. But now, as we see some new drivers come in, old drivers go out, and the balance of power changing, they're hoping that the fan base they've created is sticky enough to remain in place, and then maybe develop new associations and see where that goes.
One of the things I think is particularly interesting when we look at this, is just the extent to which it's grown. I mean, I was flying not too long ago, and I ran into a gentleman who had a McLaren vest on, and I was like, "Oh, McLaren!" And he kind of looked at me a bit confused at first. I was like, "Oh," and we started talking about Formula One, and it turns out he had been a longtime fan. And then there was, about a week or so later, I had coffee with a very good friend of mine, and I didn't know she was a fan of Formula One, and she's like, "I got into it as a Drive to Survive." Talking about that personality aspect, it seems to have introduced a new complexity to the dynamics for the teams in particular. I mean, we have, great fan favorites like, Carlos Sainz, who have just had his appendix out and won the Australian Grand Prix. You got Fernando Alonso, who's 40 years old. Yeah, I mean, I remember him racing against Michael Schumacher back in 2005. He was one of the most amazing racing back in the day. How do you see this playing out in terms of, where you had the petrol heads and the very much, the Nigel Mansells of the world, who necessarily wouldn't be particularly fan favorites now, I guess you could say, maybe he would be. How does that change the calculus for teams? I mean, we have Lewis Hamilton leaving Mercedes, where he's been for, several championships, and now he's going to Ferrari. How does that change the team's calculus, to have that celebrity aspect now?
Well, first off, Nigel Mansell and that magnificent moustache would have been a a fan favorite in any era.
Fair enough. Fair
But
enough.
no, I think it's an interesting thing that we're going to see how it sort of shapes teams' relationships to their drivers. One of the funny things about F1 that not a lot of people sort of appreciate, who are outsiders to the sport, is that while it's true that Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen are paid fortunes and rank among some of the very highest earning sportsmen on earth, 50-60 million dollars a year to race for their teams, a large number of drivers on the F1 grid, in fact probably a majority in some seasons, are not paid by their teams but actually pay their teams through sponsors for the privilege to race to race in F1. And so and that sometimes that's through their own corporate sponsorships. There have been drivers who have been sponsored by the government, the state-owned companies in Venezuela to drive for Williams. So the sort of appeal of their driver, the sort of a corporate sponsorship appeal of a driver has been something that has long been sort of taken into consideration by teams when they think about their driver lineup. And I think it's sort of perfectly reasonable to suggest that a driver who is a great character on Drive to Survive might be more valuable to a team through the sort of interest and following that they bring in, than a driver who might actually be quicker on the track but sort of doesn't deliver any of that stuff for them. Again, to sort of the parallel with soccer, we've seen when on the few occasions that Cristiano Ronaldo or Lionel Messi have switched clubs, you've seen hundreds of thousands of followers leave the social media account of one and join the social media account of other in a way that is sort of very valuable to the team that they're joining. And we may have already seen this with Daniel Ricciardo, who sort of found his way back to Red Bull, which sort of felt as much about bringing in a beloved Drive to Survive character as it did to finding the best possible guy to be the test driver, as it was then.
Ricardo very much seemed to enjoy his role as sort of Red Bull brand ambassador almost more than anything else.
Exactly.
Although we talked about Nigel Mansell, I would have loved to see the Lauda Hunt days on Drive to Survive. I think that would have been an absolute riot.
Absolutely.
I'm guessing that Niki Lauda would have hated it.
He would have hated, but he'd been such a great character.
Oh, for sure.
Completely unfiltered. I mean, Netflix would have just been eating that up as much as he hated it. I mean, if we fast forward today, one of the things that I thought was quite striking is the speed with which, and the narrative, obviously with Max Verstappen and Red Bull's dominance the last couple of seasons, that the sport became boring. Do you see that as a function of the Drive to Survive era, or is that a function of just a short-term memory? I mean, we had eras of dominance from Ferrari with Michael Schumacher, and then Mercedes dominance with Lewis Hamilton, and then now we're just kind of in a new cycle of Red Bull dominance. But the calls that suggested that it's boring or uninteresting seem to be relatively new. Am I right in thinking that, or is that just short-term memory?
Well, I think it's less a question of short-term memory and more an issue of no memory at all. For a lot of people who came in 2017, 18, 19, they've never actually experienced one of these true long-term dynasties. But in fact, that is the natural state of F1. One team takes a set of rules, and the rules change every 4 or 5 years, takes a set of rules, builds a car that actually interprets those rules in a more efficient, more effective way than anyone else, builds the fastest car, and if they happen to have the best driver in that, then they can easily rack up 3 or 4 championships. And we've seen that a lot in the sport's modern history is full of those. Whether it's Verstappen now, whether it was Hamilton during the 2000s in his Mercedes, the 2010s in his Mercedes. Before that, we had Red Bull and Seb Vettel. We had Michael Schumacher and Ferrari, and that's just this century. So that is kind of the natural equilibrium of this sport. But to anyone who tuned in 2021, for instance, saw the most dramatic conclusion of all time between Max and Lewis in Abu Dhabi on the final lap of the final race, with plenty of controversy and plenty of drama from the pit wall, where you saw Toto and Christian Horner lobbying the race director in real time and tearing their hair out as this race comes to a climax. Suddenly tuning in the next season and watching Max Verstappen dominate is kind of a head scratcher, because this was not how the new fans were conditioned to think F1 was going to be. But in fact, you need to have these periods of dominance, or they happen. And as someone like Stefano Domenicali, the F1 CEO who used to be at Ferrari, says and freely admits, we actually need these periods of dominance to build up the history of the sport. 20 years from now, you want to look back at great drivers like Max Verstappen, and you need to see that there was a while where he was just untouchable. So to build those legends, you have to sometimes suffer through the quote unquote boring seasons.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that if there is a difference, it's not that people are now, complaining that F1 has become boring. It's that Liberty Media seems completely fine with that and happy to allow Verstappen to rack up a few, seasons worth of championship wins. Whereas in the past, I think when Bernie Ecclestone was running the show, he was maybe a little bit more responsive to accusations that the sport had become boring. And again, that's sort of one of the situations where having a guy like Bernie running the sport, who's who happened to be whose closest sort of associate happened to be the head of the FIA, meant that the two of them could just change the rules like that when they felt that the sport was becoming too boring, and immediately sort of table flip everything and send the team that was at the front, to the middle, and a team from the middle, a team from the back all the way to the front. We saw this happen with Williams in the early 90s, where Bernie felt they were becoming too dominant because of the way that they had sort of harnessed the growing power of computing and into the engineering of their cars. One day he just decided to ban electronic aids from F1 cars. We saw it in the early 2000s when Schumacher was rattling off championship after championship, largely because Ferrari had sort of perfected the tire for the era. Bernie banned tire changes. These sorts of very radical changes to the rules of the sport were something that Bernie was very happy to do, because the one thing that he didn't want F1 to be accused of ever was being boring. Whereas Liberty seemed to have a much more sort of sanguine approach, at least for now. And it'll be interesting to see whether they become a little sort of quicker on the trigger with sort of unforeseen rules changes as things progress.
I guess that makes Adrian Newey the most powerful potentially, but something the most important man in Formula One at the moment, because it sounds like Ferrari is courting him very aggressively and has been. I think we got one more question here. So soccer and F1 are sort of similar in that anyone can play soccer and anyone can drive a car, but of course nobody should race their car. Red Bull has tried to create exciting new sports. What national and international policies would facilitate growth of new sports that could also be used as soft power? So I guess bridging a bit of the geopolitics and the sport aspect. So do you see other potential areas of growth? Red Bull is an extreme sports brand as much as it is a energy drink. Do you see other potentially branching out, or kind of what's the next big thing? Is it esports? Is it a Formula E?
Well, esports, for instance, is already has massive followings, and you see people through F1 and through soccer both trying to channel that. We saw, FIFA actually organizes major esports tournaments now, has tried to bring that in-house. And similarly, Max Verstappen, who is the most dominant racer on the track, is also one of the most dominant e-racers in the world, and has a massive following. The first thing he wants to do after any Grand Prix is go back to Monaco, get into his sim rig, and go stream on Twitch. So that aspect of it is already very present. In terms of using sports to grow soft power, I mean, it's kind of a chicken or the egg problem. And in this one, you really need the chicken of having a super popular global sport already in place for the soft power to latch onto that. You can't just do it. You can't decide that bocce ball is going to be your instrument of soft power, because it only will reach as far as the people who already play bocce ball. The reason the Premier League worked was because it already had a massive global following. It was already in 200 countries. So it's a built-in reach, and you kind of need that already there. And that's why we haven't seen the Gulf, for instance, pour money into baseball. Baseball is maybe a dozen countries in the world, but we do see them going to soccer. We see them going into various global racing series. We didn't see them in cycling, which seems to have a greater reach than certain North American sports.
I don't take it NASCAR is going global.
No, I don't think so. But that said, if you look at F1 and soccer, these were just the most popular sports in Britain in the 1980s, which means that if we're looking for the next one, I believe that has to be either snooker or darts that are going to be the next instruments of soft power. So, exciting to see that happen.
Oh, the global coverage of that chap who just won the darts tournament was deeply impressive. Like a 16-year-old or something like that.
That's right.
I guess if I can ask one last question, just cognizant and respectful of your time, kind of what's the big F1 story that you're keeping an eye on, this season, as we go through, now we're in the third race and we've got 21 more to go.
I think the big one will be to see if the cracks in the Red Bull machine are finally beginning to show. We saw a rare mechanical failure from them this weekend in Australia. It was the first time that Max Verstappen had not finished a race since Australia 2 years ago. So, if that's true and the Red Bull's not as infallible as we thought it was, and the Ferrari actually is more reliable than it has been in recent years, we might have a real title battle on our hands. And I think, of course, we'll also be watching Lewis Hamilton just to see how his final year at Mercedes plays out. He seems to have lost a little bit of interest. He keeps every weekend, he seems to be saying, this is the worst weekend I've ever had. So, if he can kind of limp to the finish line through this season and then miraculously rediscover a love for the sport and a passion for racing, then I think we could be in for something special in store next year. But that relationship and that tension as the Mercedes era kind of winds down is going to be fascinating to watch.
Yeah, I think that's right. Ferrari, what happens, what does Ferrari look like in 25, 26 is the sort of, very, very, will be one of the most intriguing things to watch. You mentioned that, Lewis Hamilton's going there. We discussed Adrian Newey. It looks like he's being courted by them. If Christian Horner ends up leaving Red Bull, does he end up at Ferrari? It will be fascinating to see what that looks like, because it's clear that Ferrari are sort of pinning their hopes on the 26 rule change as the time when they can maybe, get back to the front.
Well, it's going to be particularly interesting if Carlos Sainz can continue his performance and outshine both Hamilton and Leclerc, as he's without a seat next year. So we'll certainly have to watch. Josh Robinson, Jonathan Clegg, thank you so much for joining us today. Selfishly, this is one of my favorite events that we've done because I get to talk about two of my favorite things, Formula One and Premier League. The book is called The Formula. I'm going to try to hold it up and see if the blur decides to cooperate. There we go. It is available now. I strongly recommend it if you are a fan of Formula One, either from the Drive to Survive era or from earlier eras, which good for you. Pick it up. It's great. And thank you so much for joining us, and look forward to meeting you both in Washington, D.C., and we can go to the F1 arcade when it opens.
We'll be there.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, gentlemen. Take care.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
Bye.